Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Call of the Wild in Our Cities, Morality, Race, and the Environment, a conversation with Cornell William Brooks. I am Vicki Spruill. I'm the president and CEO at the New England Aquarium, and tonight's event is made possible with generous support from the Lowell Institute, which allows the aquarium to offer lectures like this one free of charge. We're also grateful to the Boston Globe for their collaboration presenting this event. For more than 50 years, we've worked to ensure a vital and vibrant ocean. At the aquarium, we educate and inspire others to take action to protect the blue planet. We conduct rigorous research to find solutions to ocean threats, and we rescue, rehabilitate, and release endangered and threatened sea turtles back into the wild. Climate change affects not only marine mammals and animals and their habitats, but also coastlines and communities across Boston, including Central Wharf, which is home to the aquarium. We also know that climate change is a climate justice issue, and that communities of color are disproportionately impacted by this and so many other environmental issues. That's why, among our other programs, we are also working towards creating a resilient, welcoming, and accessible downtown waterfront for all, and why I am so looking forward to hearing from tonight's speaker, Cornell William Brooks. It is my honor to introduce Cornell. He's a distinguished professor, he's a civil rights attorney, he's an ordained minister, and former president and CEO of the NAACP, as well as a dear friend of mine. We created some positive disruptions to the status quo around the issue of racial equity while we were both living in Washington, D.C. I was leading the Council on Foundations and he, the NAACP. Cornell is a Hauser Professor of the Practice of Nonprofit Organizations and Professor of the Practice of Public Leadership and Social Justice at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's also Director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice at the school's Center for Public Leadership and Visiting Professor of the Practice of Prophetic Religion and Public Leadership at the Harvard Divinity School. Under his leadership as former president and CEO of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP secured 12 significant legal victories, including laying the groundwork for the first statewide legal challenge to prison-based gerrymandering. And in 2015, he conceived of and led the America's Journey for Justice March from Selma, Alabama to Washington, D.C., over 40 days and 1,000 miles. Aside from his work in higher education and nonprofit leadership, Cornell's expansive career also spans the fields of law and public policy. He has served as senior counsel and acting director of the Office of Communications Business Opportunities at the Federal Communications Commission, executive director of the Fair Housing Council of Greater Washington, and as a trial attorney at both the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law and the U.S. Department of Justice. He's also served as judicial clerk for the Chief Judge Sam J. Irwin III on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 4th District. Cornell holds a JD from Yale Law School and a Master of Divinity from Boston University School of Theology, where he was a Martin Luther King Jr. Scholar. He is a 4th generation ordained minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Cornell joins us tonight to discuss our shared responsibility to the environment and why, in the face of climate change and current urban and suburban revitalization efforts, a new type of citizen activism is needed. It is my honor, my privilege, and my pleasure to welcome Cornell William Brooks.
Thank you so much, Vicki. I wanted to begin with a word of appreciation that comes from a deeply personal space. When I served as president and CEO of the NAACP, you were not only a stellar colleague, but also a warm and supportive friend during the difficult moments that we often and all face as leaders. So I just begin with a word of gratitude for not only your support and leadership then, but your support and leadership in this moment. And I can't think of anyone whose hands are more capable, more skilled, more needed in this moment for the work of the aquarium. I also want to express appreciation to the Boston Globe, the same Globe I read as a student in seminary and at Yale Law School, and it has supported so much great work over the years. The Lowell Institute for supporting me in this lecture, but also the Lowell lecture I gave at Boston University School of Theology a few years ago. And lastly, I express appreciation and a deep gratitude to the membership, the leadership, the supporters of the New England Aquarium. It is because of the work that you do every day that I have the opportunity to speak with you about some of the most critical challenges of our time. So this evening, I just want to begin with a humble story that suggests the genesis of the title of this brief talk. Growing up in part in Nashville, Tennessee, as a third grader, I attended a school in downtown Nashville. It was a school like many schools were then in a inner city neighborhood. Not too many green spaces, not too many blue spaces, but it was a place filled with love and a dedication to teaching. In my third grade class, I had a wonderful teacher who set aside the afternoons for a half hour or so of reading. And so this teacher chose for a student, a classroom of predominantly African-American students, the book, The Call of the Wild by Jack London. Now, this book may not have seemed like a literally obvious choice for a group of children in downtown Nashville, but this book by Jack London was read to us day after day after day. And in the listening, in the hearing of the words of Jack London, I discovered a wonderful story, a wonderful tale about a dog, Saint Bernard and collie, of immense size and immense humanity, who was kidnapped and taken into the North Country. The story fascinated us, enthralled us, excited us. And yet what also enthralled and excited this classroom full of third graders were the descriptions of the North Country, the dangerous and yet beautiful and tranquil rivers, the glistening snow, the glaciers, the ice, the primordial forest that seemed to call out to human beings and dogs. This was a story that literally captured my imagination, so much so that this many years later as a father, I've taken my sons to Arcadia Park up in Maine, to much of Canada, because of the vivid descriptions of nature, the vivid descriptions of the natural world, the blue world, the green world, and this wonderful, powerful, emotionally evocative, life transformative description of a call of the wild. And so this evening, just for a few moments, I want to lift up as a theme the call of the wild in our cities: morality, race, and the environment. That is to say, the call of the wild in our cities: morality, race, and the environment. And I lift up 3 points for your consideration as ministers who are also trial lawyers are wont to do. These themes or these points of consideration might be characterized thus. The first of which is moving from emergency calls to the call of the wild to ultimately the call to serve. And secondly, the Imago Dei and the Imagination Day. The Imago Dei, being created in the image of God with all the ethical and moral responsibilities that come with that. Moving from the Imago Dei to the Imagination Day. And lastly, biophilia and bioagape. From biophilia to bioagape. I choose these three themes, these three lessons, if you will, and this theme to speak to the perilous moment in which we find ourselves. I want to just for a few moments take measure of the moment in which we find ourselves, this morally poignant, history-laden moment, this Lowell lecture in which we gather, we come together as a New England aquarium community, discuss and to engage and to discourse on the environment, the status of our planet and nature herself. Over the course of the last year and a half, we have been orally inundated. Our minds and our hearts have been inundated with certain emergency calls. In the midst of this racial reckoning in which we've seen the fault lines of race exposed and exacerbated, the fissures of ethnicity exposed and exacerbated, we have seen in the midst of a global pandemic in which we initially responded with the 50-state response. In the midst of this pandemic, we've heard certain emergency calls. In many of our cities, we have heard the screaming sirens of ambulances in our streets. We have also heard equally emotionally wrenching sounds of ventilators electronically gasping for breath in the ICU wards. We have heard these emergency calls of EMTs, 911 calls, ambulances, literally reminding us on a near daily basis of the nation and the globe's public state of emergency. We've seen, we've heard, we've experienced these emergency calls, that is to say, anxiety-ridden calls of parents seeking information about the contagiousness of the virus relative to their children. We have been on emergency calls, trepidation-filled calls, as parents seeking information about the dangers of the virus for our children's grandparents. We have been on emergency calls, if you will. And yet there are other calls that are more subtle, equally serious, perhaps less appreciated. As the pandemic wore on and the fatality count reached 600,000, equaling the death count of the pandemic of 1917, we heard in the midst of the emergency calls, in this moment, other calls. These calls were echoed in the voices of children, shuttered in, sheltered in place from blue spaces and green spaces. These calls reverberate, resonate, echo in the voices of children quarantined away from COVID-19, but also quarantined in, racially insulated, ethnically insulated, classically, I should say, socially calcified cells of isolation. We have seen our children literally separated from the natural environment. Many children suffer from a great many of the maladies of the poor. When children suffer from asthma, and we know that proximity to green spaces and blue spaces is medicinal, it is therapeutic, it is health-inducing. When we know that children with asthma benefit from being in those kinds of spaces, we hear in their voices a call for blue spaces, a call for green spaces, a call, if you will, to the wild, and a call into the wilderness. When children who are often underdiagnosed, undertreated, untreated for ADHD, when we know that they benefit from exposure to nature, being in nature, and that time in the midst of trees, time beside a riverbank, time at the ocean speaks to their spirit, speaks to their emotions, speaks to their mental well-being, their cognitive well-being. When we know that, and we see and hear children suffering in the midst of a pandemic, their voices represent a call to green spaces, a call for blue spaces, a call of the wild, and a call into wilderness. When adults and children are less mentally healthy, less mentally whole, less mentally grounded. When these adults and children are separated from the environment, when we hear their voices, voices strained by racism, voices strained by classism, voices strained by gentrification, voices strained by growing income inequality, voices strained by all the maladies of the poor, we know that when they spend time in green spaces, in blue spaces, beside the ocean, beside a river, when we hear in their voices mental anguish, emotional pain, we yet hear the call of the wild. And so I'm reminded that we in Boston are in a very special place. And it is a place in which our voices are morally, I should say, our ears are morally attuned to the voices of children, the voices of adults, the voices of neighbors, the voices of Bostonians, the voices of the people, the citizens of New England. And the reason our voices are, I should say, our ears are so attuned to those voices is because Boston gave America its first city park, first arboretum. Boston gave this country the first martyr for freedom. That is to say, Crispus Attucks, who died, who shed the reddest of blood in the shadow of the green of the Boston Common. This city has given so much to this country, and it puts us in a place where we can yet hear the call of the wild in our cities. But I want to suggest to you, when we have to make hard decisions about investment and infrastructure, about environmental equity and the environment herself as a community stakeholder, as a member of a coalition, when we have to make hard decisions about growth and stability, parks and aquariums, transportation and environmental access, how do we amplify those voices? How do we engage in a form of advocacy that allows the most marginalized voices to be heard, and to be heard in concert, to be heard as a chorus of righteousness and a chorus of justice? How do we do that? As a professor of the Harvard Kennedy School, I might invoke the scholarship of my colleagues or the practice of the activists in the streets, particularly those young practitioners of democracy who have been in the streets for weeks and days and months on end. I might do so, but as a civil rights lawyer and a fourth generation ordained minister, I want to suggest to you that people not only think about issues in terms of law and policy, but right and wrong. And in fact, I'm reminded that the lingua franca of public discourse is not merely law and policy, but right and wrong. People think about not merely maximizing their interests, but also maximizing the good, maximizing community, maximizing their ideals, maximizing their vision of themselves, their country, their community, and their cities. So in other words, in this moment, it's important for us to not merely instruct, but also to inspire. Not merely to speak in terms of case law and case studies, but also speak about moral precept and moral example. In fact, I want to suggest to you that it's important for us to not merely speak in terms of best interests, but to speak about best interests wrapped in our best ideals. If we do not do so, we will continue to see the worst civic behavior on the part of our citizens and our neighbors. And so in this moment, if we are to respond fully in the most morally fulsome way to the challenge of a planet on an existential deadline to come to grips with and to grapple with climate change, to do so, we have to speak, yes, in terms of law and policy, yes, in terms of best interest, yes, in terms of what's best for our communities, best for our cities, but we must also speak in terms of what's best for our souls. We must not shy away from the importance of having a moral voice. And so I want to say to you, we have to move from simply responding to that which we see, that which we tweet, that which we post about in terms of an emergency. Yes, there is an emergency in terms of a state of emergency with respect to public health and the pandemic. There's a state of emergency in terms of the existential threat to the planet, but we have to go beyond that, to go beyond talking about emergency calls to the call of the wild, to the call, if you will, of nature to our children, to our families, to our well-being, to our heart well-being, our mental well-being, our emotional well-being. We must be transparent and clear that this is critically important, but going beyond that, not merely a call of the wild, a call to wilderness, a call to blue spaces, a call to natural spaces, but we must also understand that the moment we're in represents a call to service. Yes, we are in the midst of a crisis. Yes, we are in the midst of a calamitous moment. Yes, we are in the midst of an emotionally poignant moment. It is nevertheless a moment that represents an opportunity for leadership. People are looking for leaders, looking for advocates, looking for coalition builders who have the ring, the resonance, if you will, of moral authority. And so we have to appreciate the fact, note this, that in our oldest religious traditions, in this particular instance in Judaism, a story is told about a couple, a man and a woman, who experienced a call. They experienced a call in a natural space, in a green space, in a blue space, with a river. They experienced a call in a place called Eden. They tell us that this garden was not zone restricted. This garden didn't have any occupancy requirements. This garden was not gentrified, not particularly well developed. And in fact, they tell us that in this garden that there wasn't an eviction crisis. In fact, there was only one citizen of the garden evicted, and that was for bad behavior, and he was called the devil. Now, the story tells us that this couple was called, they were called, if you will, not to manage the plants and animals as crops and products, but they were called to name that which they were given as creation. So in other words, the first call to service was a call to the environment. That is the first creation story in which we read about. It is a call to take care of that which has been entrusted to us. And so in this moment, it is important for us to speak about the call to the environment as a call to service, as a call that is powerful, as a call that is transformative. It is important for us to appreciate that a calling is critically important in this moment. Why? Because we must not allow the emergency call of the moment to silence the magisterial call of the hour. We must appreciate in this moment that it is not enough for us to speak in terms of the dry technicalities of the challenge. We must speak in emotional terms. We must speak in morally compelling terms. We must speak in ethically expansive terms. We must speak with the authority of a generation that speaks for the next generation and the next generation and the generation after that. We must speak in such a way that our words have resonance and literally reverberate in our communities, across our families, and literally down through time. Second point I want to lift up here is the Imago Dei and the Imagination Day. I'm reminded that many of our young people have lifted up the clarion call that Black Lives Matter. They assert that Black Lives Matter, understanding profoundly that Black Lives Matter is the moral predicate to the ethical conclusion that all lives matter. Unless the first is true, the second can never be true. But I want to suggest to you that these young practitioners of democracy who took to the streets in the wake of George Floyd's murder, 26 million Americans across 550 jurisdictions, and in a majority of these rallies, these protests, these demonstrations, in the majority of these civic gatherings, those asserting Black Lives Matter in the main were not in fact Black. This was a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-generational gathering of Americans asserting the humanity of one person on behalf of our collective humanity. But they were, in a real sense, asserting the imago Dei, the notion that we're all created in the image of God and as such have innate worth and value. This is not a strange conception. This is a theological gift, if you will, of Judaism that was nevertheless recognized in the Declaration of Independence, which of course asserts that all men, all people, all humanity is created equal and that we have certain inalienable rights. This is an Enlightenment ideal. So in other words, when young people gather in the streets and assert that Black Lives Matter, they are literally reflecting some of the sentiments of the most enlightened of our founding fathers and our founding mothers. So this notion of the imago Dei is critically important because what it says to us is it says that the most redlined Black family is important. The most environmentally isolated Latino family is important. The most impoverished family is important. The most transportation estranged, if you will, suburbanite is important. We are all critically important. We all have innate worth and value in this moment because we, at least for those in a religious tradition, believe that we're all created in the image of God. But I want to suggest to you that as important and as powerful as that is, we might want to say a little more with respect to the environment. Because many of our religious traditions teach us that while humanity may have been created in the image of God and as such have innate worth and value, many of our creation stories in our religious traditions teach us that the creation itself is an expression of the imagination of God. And so when we look at the beauty of the Boston Common, it is an expression of the imagination of God. When we see a rowboat on the Charles, it is an expression of the imagination of God. When we glimpse the ocean, when we glimpse the fish of the sea, they are expressions of the imagination of God. And so in this moment, I want to suggest to us, whether you are a Jew, a Christian, Hindu, or Buddhist, agnostic, or atheist, this notion that somehow there is something powerful, something beautiful, something transcendent about that which surrounds us that gives it worth and gives it value. And the reason why this is critically important is because when we construct in a legal infrastructure to protect both people and the environment, perhaps we want to put them on more equal moral footing. Perhaps we want to consider the environment to be a part of our coalitions, the environment to be a key stakeholder, the environment to be a key partner, the environment to be a neighbor, the environment to be a citizen, if you will. And so if we understand that we as human beings, in the midst of this racial reckoning, if we understand that human beings cannot be reduced to a hashtag, neither can our planet. George Floyd was a human being. Our planet has worth and value. Lastly, we're reminded. Actually, let me come back. I want to make one more point on this in terms of the image and imagination of God. If I can just share with you, as president and CEO of the NAACP, I was called, if you will, to public service. I received a very particular call to go to Flint, Michigan. When I arrived in Flint, Michigan in the early days of the Flint water crisis, I got off the plane, hastened into downtown Flint, hastened into a community meeting, And in that meeting, I met a mother and father who had their arms wrapped around a little boy. They brought the little boy to my side, and then the father reached down to the hem of his son's shirt and pulled it up toward his shoulders. And I glimpsed on the boy's back a rash, and the father and mother said to me in morally unanimous tones and in emotional unison that this rash on our boy's back is the result of the water being poisoned in Flint. Now, when I looked at that boy's back, I have to admit to you, I thought to myself, yes, this child of God, this little boy's back has been defaced. But his back was defaced because the environment was desecrated. It was only when we decided to both toxify and commodify the water in Flint that the child's back was defaced and the environment was desecrated. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that the child had value. He was created in the image of God. But the Flint River, the Great Lakes, are created and as expressions of the imagination of God. And if we were to value the rivers, the Great Lakes, the oceans as expressions of the imagination of God, we would not face little boys poisoned and desecrated and defaced as children of God. Turning to that last point about moving from biophilia to bioagape. Across the valley of time, thinkers have lifted up biophilia, if you will, as a way to understand our relationship with the environment. Going back to agape, thinkers as diverse as Eric Fromm and E.O. Wilson have tried to help us intellectually appreciate that which we emotionally sense that we have and are caught up by biophilia, a relation, an affection, a hunger, a desire to be with and in the midst of and in communication with living things and living beings. It is something in us, something that speaks to the environment in which we find ourselves. When you stand next to the ocean and listen to the ocean as a voice whispering into your spirit, you're being enthralled, caught up in a spirit, if you will, of biophilia. When you stand beside a river and watch ripples in the wind, you're caught up in a spirit of biophilia. Now, I want to suggest to you, as powerful as biophilia is, having a love, an affection, a desire, a hunger to be in communication, to be in communion with nature. I want to suggest to you, as an amateur theologian, that perhaps we should also invoke within ourselves a sense of bioagape. You recall that Martin Luther King loved to delineate the three forms of love as described by the Greeks. Of course, there's philia, that is to say, the love among friends, the love among siblings, a brotherly love, a sisterly love, a fraternal love. Dr. King also spoke about not only love as philia, but love as eros, the love between two people, a romantic love, a love that sets your heart into motion and inspires visions of romance. Two powerful forms of love. But Dr. King also spoke about love as agape, an unconditional love, a sacrificial love, a love that calls you out of yourself and into somebody else's life, a love that reflected the theology, if you will, of Martin Buber, I thou, a sacred love, a holy love, a powerful love, a love that allows one to lay down your life for your country, a love that allows you to lay down your life for your fellow human being, a love that literally calls you out of yourself. And yes, a love that would call you to give yourself, to give of yourself for this planet, this globe, this earth that is given so much to us. Perhaps we need to move from biophilia to bioagape. What would happen if we had an unconditional love for the planet, an unconditional love for our rivers, an unconditional love for our oceans, an unconditional love for our environment? What if we did not predicate our agape love on the cost or the expense of gentrification? What would happen if we had such an agape love for our rivers, our oceans, our environment, that we did not put a tax of convenience? That is to say, we protect the environment when it's convenient, but we choose to leave it naked and vulnerable and exposed when it is not convenient. What would happen if we had an agape love, a sacrificial love for the environment in this moment? I want to suggest to you that this agape love calls us out of ourselves. When we literally see children who experience the call of the wild, who experience a call to blue spaces and green spaces, to oceans and rivers and forests and desert and wetland and marshes. When we have an agape love, an unconditional love for children and an unconditional love for the environment, we can't stand to have those who have an unconditional love for one another to be unduly separated. We want our children in natural spaces. When we have an agape love, we give sacrificially, yes, to our mosques, yes, to our churches, yes, to our temples, but also organizations, also institutions, also aquariums that dedicate their institutional lives to protecting that which has been entrusted to us. When we have an agape love, a sacrificial love, we understand that protecting the environment is protecting the family, it's protecting our children, it's protecting our parents, it is protecting our legacy. When we have an agape love, it is the kind of love that literally calls us out of ourselves. It is this kind of love that can inspire. It is this kind of love that can ignite our moral imaginations. It is this kind of love that allows us to stand beside the Charles or stand beside the ocean and say, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. It is this kind of love that allows us to say that we are morally confident that we will do right by our environment. We will do right by our rivers. We will do right by our oceans. We will do right by that which God has given to us as an expression of God's moral imagination. This is a moment that calls for love, an unapologetic love for the environment as an expression of the imagination of God and a partial reflection of his image. This agape love in this moment calls for a kind of activism. That means that we can ill afford the kind of compartments, departments, and silos that allow us to be stratified by big organizations and small organizations. Agape love calls us in this moment to work across discipline, to work across region, to work across neighborhoods, to work across the fissures of race and the fault lines of ethnicity. Agape love for the environment means that we're able to bridge stereotype, bridge preconceptions, bridge differences to do the work that we are called to do. Agape love means that the work is so important, the service is so critical, the hour is so nigh that we will do whatever and with whomever we can to do the work that is necessary for us to do in this hour. Agape love means that when we look at our environment, we see a reflection of the Creator, when we also see the faces of our children. And so perhaps in listening to these few words in this little lecture, perhaps some child might be inspired by the words I heard so many years ago, to love the environment, to love open spaces, green spaces, blue spaces, but all of these spaces as holy and sacred spaces. So with that said, thank you so much for giving me and affording me an opportunity to share with you these few words in this little lecture. Thank you. It is my understanding that we have an opportunity for questions and answers.
I had trouble just a minute getting in. Wow, you have inspired me as you have done time and time again. And we have a number of questions that came in, and I'm trying to put them in clusters so we can get to as many of them as possible. You know, there are several that follow a religious theme, but I'm going to start with one that says, this is from George, who says, how do we preserve the concepts of the nature principle and help people understand the need for green spaces, and I would say blue spaces, in cities and towns, that neighborhoods should not be overbuilt, and that balconies should not count as open space? How do we preserve those concepts? Agape love is one way, I suppose, but how can you get, yeah.
Sure. Part of it assumes that in speaking about agape love, I don't want to in any way suggest that agape love is a substitute for equity.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, agape love transcends and inspires equity. So in other words, to count balconies as open spaces means that people who are not on balconies are subject to closed spaces. And so when we think about valuing the environment, we value it to such a degree that we believe more people should have access to it, which has everything to do with our architecture, right? So in other words, agape is not ethereal.
Mm-hmm.
It is not nebulous. It has everything to do with how we make investments. So in other words, if I love everybody in my condo association, but I don't love everybody in my neighborhood, that suggests a certain kind of development. If on the other hand, we have a much more expansive understanding of the love for the environment and love for people, it's more inclusive. It really speaks to our architecture. It speaks to our development. It speaks to bringing those kinds of questions into some of these development deals early on, right? So in other words, so much of the time, the balcony questions, the access questions come at the point of protest and demonstration.
Mm-hmm.
And I can just tell you, as having led one of the largest grassroots organizations in the country, when people say, we're concerned about the environment, we're concerned about your issues, but we're concerned only at the point of protest, demonstrations, or boycotts, they're not concerned enough. So so that nature principle really needs to be embedded in these conversations over a longer arc of time with broader stake of stakeholders brought together early on. And that's the leadership.
Yeah, so I'm going to follow on with a question from Hannah, who's right on this thread, who says, faced with formidable opponents, and in this case, she's referring to real estate developers, how can we best make our city leadership understand and get them on board with the idea of this responsibility towards ourselves and our future, towards nature here in our cities?
Well, one of the reasons why I lifted up this notion of the Imago Dei and imagination is because when we advocate on behalf of the environment in isolation, we are literally fracturing the coalition.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a certain economic security to appreciate environment in isolation as opposed to environment in community. we all have, many of us have an unstratified appreciation for the environment. The challenge, however, is some people can afford to just think about it. And so concretely, define the issues sufficiently broad that you bring together sufficiently broad coalition, number one. Number two, thinking about the language, right? So in other words, if we speak only in terms of language of endangered species and cute animals, leaving aside cute children and endangered communities, it doesn't resonate. Number three, challenge those who like to put economic priorities over moral priorities to justify their economic priorities, because often their timeline for deeming what is economically important is too short. Mm-hmm. It is insufficiently economically inclusive, meaning when we start talking about who benefits from the environment, who benefits from access, and begin to define those benefits broadly and do a better job of putting price tags on things that are truly important, it puts the other side in a position where they have to defend instead of putting us on the defense. Mm-hmm. Part of that is being skilled in that. Related to that point is building bigger and better teams, more sophisticated teams. Meaning, it's been my observation that quite often when we advocate on behalf of the most vulnerable, we act like we're the most vulnerable instead of the most powerful. And what I mean by that is, that means like literally bringing to the table our own lawyers. You know, as I like to teach my students, when you talk to a big law firm, never use the word free, always say pro bono. It means the same thing, but lawyers are more inclined to say yes when you say, we want you to take on this cause pro bono. Going to your universities and saying, we need economists to cost out the benefits of the economic project. Number three, engaging folks at business schools to talk about the way that a deal is flawed, right? So in other words, let us not be unduly and analytically and intellectually too deferential to people who may or may not be qualified to speak on behalf of our communities. And so just being very, very practical here, it means building bigger teams, more sophisticated teams, partnering. And lastly, this whole notion that we need the street activists in one corner, the scholars in another corner, the suburbanites someplace else, and the folks in the cities, that doesn't work, right? In other words, the environment needs a big team. And we need to act like a big team, bring people together and be thoughtful and be strategic. And lastly, as I like to tell my students, we don't always have to be the smartest person in the room. Endeavor to be the second smartest person in the room, right? In other words, we want to give authentic voices a time to be heard. Like in every meeting, sometimes the scholars want to speak first. They want to read from their papers. The people with the PhDs want to dominate the conversation. Sometimes what we need to do is like let the people who are closest to the problem speak first. Let's back them up. Let's bring in, data to back them up. I've seen this work many, many times. It's hard work. It's sophisticated work. But the reason why we know it works is because so often these strategies are deployed against us to our detriment.
Amen, amen. Okay, so this is one that actually, it's not my question. This comes from Carolyn, but I am curious about this one too. Biblical mandates can call for humans to dominate the natural world. Right. How do we counter cultural biases like this, which seem to enable and excuse environmental destruction for human gain?
That's right. That's right.
That's a good philosophical one.
It's a philosophical one, but a very powerful one. And I'll give you an example. In our criminal justice system, notions of damnation support the death penalty against the guilty and innocent. Quaker theology gave rise to solitary confinement. So some of these theological ideas can be very powerful in terms of good, but also dangerous in terms of bad things. So when it comes to the creation stories, lending support to us being uncontrolled, unsupervised, morally unsupervised lords over nature, first of all, we need to take the people back to Genesis, take them back to the creation stories, because nowhere in the creation story are Adam and Eve called to refer to plants and animals as crops, and nowhere does it say that. What it does say is you give the animals and plants names. you have charge and responsibility over this creation, right? So in other words, the commodification of the environment, our idolatrous lordship over the environment, that came later. So part of this is, in terms of correcting some of these dangerous theologies, is getting the story right, number one. Number two, I have deep respect for sacred text, but there's a certain kind of backward and dangerous literalism that can destroy, Adam, Eve, and the garden. Right? So my point being is, the story is supposed to inspire us to take care of creation, not damn us into models that don't work. So I think the question is very, very powerful, simply because when you have, say, powerful economic interests, say, the environment is meant for us. And what we mean by that is meant for our economic lordship. So my point being is, I would take some of these theological notions and subvert them, right? So in other words, instead of saying, Mr. MBA, and I have much respect for my folks, colleagues at the Harvard Business School, but Mr. MBA, this is not good stewardship, and even good economics, because your time frame is too narrow and too short.
Okay. So I want to turn us to climate change here. And I'm wondering if you could speak to some of the links between systemic racism and climate change. As I mentioned in my introduction, communities of color are obviously disproportionately affected, not only by climate change, but so many other environmental issues. And I'm just wondering if you might speak to some of those links.
So when we think about climate change in terms of communities of vulnerability, as we all know, the communities, coastal cities, non-coastal areas affected by dramatic shifts in climate, the people with the fewest resources, the most tenuous grip on the safety net, are often poor communities and communities of color. So just the lead up to what may well be cataclysmic environmental events is literally a long road of vulnerability, heightened vulnerability for communities of color, for poor people. But I want to note this, Vicki, that the pandemic teaches us in many ways the inclusiveness of exclusivity, right? The pandemic, we saw it was supposed to affect the most vulnerable. And for many people, they assumed that meant Black and brown people. We didn't necessarily contemplate that meant Native people. We didn't necessarily contemplate it meant seniors. We didn't necessarily contemplate it meant rural folks. So when we talk about climate change in terms of affecting the most vulnerable, we need to appreciate the most vulnerable is a very inclusive class, point one. Point two, when we think about, not only people who are vulnerable in terms of where they are, when we think about literally environmental and economic refugees. I mean, we're seeing that in Florida. We're seeing communities that are being disrupted in terms of their culture, in terms of the demographics, simply because people are fleeing to higher ground and leaving other people behind. And so the point being here is, in many ways, the climate crisis is a larger manifestation of the COVID crisis, in the sense that it exposed and exacerbated these fault lines of race and ethnicity and class and region. I would argue that this is a moment for us to literally seize leadership, right? So in other words, our society, whether we recognize it or not, appreciate it or not, is being economically reordered. It's being culturally reordered. Now we can either defer to those who are ostensibly in charge, or we can have something to say about that. And having a proactive agenda, an agenda in which the environment is not merely the byproduct of our stewardship, but in fact, the primary focus. And then also, look, and we're beginning to see this, and again, not being partisan, but trying to make an objective assessment in terms of infrastructure, how we define infrastructure. Infrastructure for whom, right? So it is about just creating blue collar jobs, about creating green collar jobs or green technologies or green-oriented communities. The point being here is every economic advance is also a regulatory opportunity, a statutory opportunity, and also a moral opportunity to literally ground the policy and a moral and cultural shift so that people not only say we're willing to vote for good things, but we're willing to fight for good things, we're willing to organize for good things. And so my point being here is, climate change is, in some ways, this is our environmental and existential Selma. Selma was an occasion where literally the people had a choice between the risk of being beaten to death and resurrecting the democracy, or consigning themselves to second-class status. Now, we can consign ourselves to being third-class citizens in a world that is facing an existential deadline that is quite perilous. Or we can seize this opportunity to literally reorder society. And that is not hubris. It's not idealistic. We've seen these tectonic shifts in world and American history over and over again. We just have to be morally proactive.
Wow. I think that's going to be our last question, and I'm sorry if I didn't get to enough of you. And just thank you so much for sticking with us and for bringing in so many good questions. And Cornell, I just can't thank you enough for spending this last hour with us, for your wisdom, for your passion, for your brilliance. Thank you for bringing attention to this. So many existential challenges we face, but I'm with you that together we can make it happen. Again, I want to thank the Lowell Institute for making tonight's lecture possible. Their generous support has allowed us to offer this lecture free of charge. And we're also grateful to the Boston Globe, who has partnered with us for our lecture series this spring, and thank you so very much. If you've enjoyed this program, and I know you have, and want to help support the ocean education and conservation work that we do at the New England Aquarium, here's my shameless plug, please look to the Mission Forward Fund at neaq.org. And again, thank you, Cornell. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Thank you and good night.